The ash in the lungs. The first day that the sky turned to iron, Elias didn't know it was the beginning of the end. He just thought a far-off prairie fire had found a new, terrible fuel. It was April 14th, 1935, a Sunday, and the air in Blackwell, Oklahoma had been warm, unnaturally soft, and buzzing with the thin, brittle optimism that only truly desperate people can manufacture. They called it the grapes of promise feeling, as though simply saying things would get better was enough to will the wheat back into existence. Elias I. Finch, a man of 28 whose face already held the etched-in grief of 40, stood with his hands braced on the split-rail fence of his 10-acre farm. His wife, the bright, tragically hopeful Clara, had just finished hanging the last of the week's wash. The clothesline, strung between a skeletal cottonwood and the lean-to that sheltered their only remaining mule, was a banner of defiance, starched white sheets and Sunday best, crisp and clean against the vast, stained canvas of the Texas-Oklahoma panhandle. "Look at that, Eli," she said, her voice lilting with a false cheer that was more heartbreaking than any complaint. She rubbed her hands on the apron, the fine grit already settling on the fresh linen. "The wind's holding west. We might even make it to church before the usual cloud." Eli didn't look at the laundry. He was staring at the horizon, not west, where a thin, familiar dust haze usually rode low and timid, but south, right where the noonday sun should have been. It wasn't haze. It was a solid, vertical wall. It looked, impossibly, like the entire world was folding in on itself. "That ain't wind, Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble, dry as the topsoil that hadn't seen a healthy rain in 4 years. That's a mountain." The sound came first, a deep, subsonic thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the earth, a mournful, industrial roar that had no place in the silence of the flatlands. Then came the birds. Not a flock, not a scattering, but an absolute, panicked eruption. Thousands of blackbirds, sparrows, and meadowlarks fleeing in a frantic, confused spiral, blotting out the already darkening sky above the Finch property. They flew so low that Eli instinctively ducked, the frantic beat of their wings a shocking, chaotic percussion against the rising, steady drone. "Eli, what is it?" Clara's cheer dissolved. Her eyes, usually the color of wet river stones, were wide with a terror he hadn't seen since the bankman came for the tractor. He didn't answer. The wall of dust was now close enough to gauge its terrifying scale. It wasn't a cloud. It was a terrestrial storm front, a towering, roiling tempest of earth and grit and pulverized life that estimated later to have been nearly 2 miles high, moving with the cold, deliberate speed of a freight train. It wasn't the red dust they knew, nor the khaki brown. It was an apocalyptic black, a solid, suffocating curtain of pulverized prairie that had choked the life out of everything from the Canadian border down to the Gulf. It was Black Sunday. Eli shoved Clara toward the house, his calloused hand a painful vice around her thin arm. "Get inside. Cover your mouth. Shut the windows, the doors, all of it. Get the bedding." They scrambled into the tiny, paint-peeled farmhouse. The air inside was already thick with the familiar grinding dust that worked its way through every crack, every seam, coating the worn furniture and the few pitiful sacks of grain they had left. This was different. As Eli wrestled the last flimsy sash window shut, the light, which had been a pale, sickly yellow, died completely. It wasn't dusk. It was an instantaneous, absolute, subterranean darkness. The air pressure dropped like a stone. The house groaned, and a fine, gritty sand began to spray inward from the window frames with the force of an angry garden hose. The roar outside became a deafening shriek. The
the sound of 5,000 years of accumulated topsoil being scoured and sucked up into the jet stream. Clara was huddled on the floor, clutching their 2-year-old daughter Juniper, whose tiny, rasping cough was the only sound Eli could hear through the gale's fury. "The sheet!" he yelled, crawling toward them. "Put the wet sheet over your heads, now!" The dust wasn't just dirt. It was pulverized silt, talc-fine, laced with the powdered remnants of buffalo grass roots, insect exoskeletons, and, most terrifyingly, the microscopic shards of quartz that made the grit not just an annoyance, but a slow, invisible killer. It slipped through their clenched teeth, into their clothes, and deep, deep into the fragile, moist tissue of their lungs. The black blizzard raged for 9 hours. It was an event so astounding, so far outside the realm of human experience, that survivors would later describe it in terms of biblical plague, geological upheaval, or the literal end of the world. Eli lay on the floor, his face buried in Clara's skirt, holding his family as the very land they had bled for tried to swallow them whole. The astonishing truth that America would spend the next decade learning was that they hadn't been fighting a drought or a depression. They had been fighting the consequences of their own spectacular, unwitting hubris, the taming of the great American desert, and the shattering of the delicate ecological balance of the prairie. When, finally, the wind subsided and the monstrous black shroud began to thin, a sickening brownish-red light filtered through the panes. Eli staggered up. The room was a disaster zone. The fine black powder was everywhere, an inch thick on the table, a mound piled against the closed door, coating the furniture like a velvet mourning shroud. But it was the silence that truly broke him. The oppressive, final silence of a land that had exhausted its rage and now offered only the cold, hard fact of its death. He opened the door. What he saw wasn't his farm. It was a nightmare landscape in monochrome. The field was no longer a field. The rows where they had optimistically planted new corn were completely gone, buried under drifts of black dust as high as his chest. The split-rail fence was entombed. The mule's lean-to was a collapsing grave. The car, their precious, essential, credit-ridden Model A, was a smooth, aerodynamic mound, its chassis buried up to the windows, a monument to their failure. Eli knew, with a terrible crystalline clarity that erased all former hope, that they were not meant to stay. The promise of the Great Plains was a lie, a geological prank played on a gullible people. Everything they owned, everything they had worked for, was now part of a migratory cloud headed east, burying everything in its path. He looked back at Clara, who stood in the doorway. Juniper nestled against her neck. The 2-year-old coughed a wet, struggling cough. "Eli," she said, her voice cracking, "our things, they're all ruined." Eli walked over to the buried car and began to dig with his bare hands, the gritty sand burning his palms. "Doesn't matter, Clara," he said, his voice now stripped of emotion, hard and practical. "We ain't taking anything that can't fit in a suitcase. We're leaving." The destination? The great, glittering, impossible salvation whispered on every dying homestead wind? California. Chapter 2. The Map of Desperation. The journey from Blackwell, Oklahoma to Bakersfield, California was not just a road trip, it was the largest domestic migration in American history. It was a river of desperation flowing west, a mass movement of over 300,000 Okies and Arkies, a tide of humanity fleeing the ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl and the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Eli Finch sold the only thing he had left that wasn't covered in a foot of sand, his small plot of land, along with the title to his buried car and the exhausted mule, for $63. The agent, a pale man from Wichita named Mr. Hemlock, wore a pressed suit and a surgical mask, a symbol of the men who profited from the destruction. "It's a generous offer, Finch," he rasped, adjusting the mask. "You wouldn't get a dime once the government declares the county a total loss." "It's blood money." Eli spit the words out like grit. But he took the bills. $63, the price of their entire life. Eli and Clara bought an ancient, rust-eaten Hudson Super 6. It wasn't the ideal transport. It was a luxury car from a forgotten decade, built heavy and low to the ground, but it had a trunk.